Welcome to this very exciting topic around yet another talk on GDPR. This is me. My name is Magda, or Maggie, as most people know me around these parts. I am not a privacy expert. I will start by saying that. But in my job, as an information security person, specialist officer, call it what you will, I actually see my job very much as a translator, kind of between business and tech people to try and get them to talk the same language. So this talk today is really my musings around questions that I've either been asked, things that I've seen, statements that I've heard people make where I'm a bit like, really? I'm not so sure that's correct. And I thought, I could probably give anybody who's kind of in the developer side just some concrete help. Couple of things that you can remember without being an expert on GDPR to try and figure out what are the right questions to ask at the start of a project. We will talk about that at the start of a project quite a bit today. Mainly, as I said, I'm going to try and give you enough information, enough questions to be able to ask the right questions. But when in doubt, go and speak to your data protection officer or privacy team. I know there is someone in your company who does this. Find out who they are and talk to them. So this won't be a complete guide to GDPR. This will not be, you'll happy to hear, a legal training session. We're not really going to talk about security, even though this is a security conference. I do know that. We're not going to be talking about breach notifications or fines or jurisdictions. So now you might ask yourself, what will we be talking about then? It's, as I said, general awareness around GDPR. It's going to help you ask the right questions, and we're going to talk about that privacy by design and by default. I promise you, GDPR is not a bad thing. So these are some of the statements that I've heard in the last couple of years. You might identify, you might have heard some of those. If you have some of your own or even questions, please let me know. Even now or later on Twitter or afterwards if you want to catch me. I'm happy to add that to this. Hopefully by the end of this talk we'll all have answered and we can kind of go true or false to all of these things. I won't spoil it for you if you think some of this is true. Anyway, we'll go through the talk and we'll see how we can answer all of these questions for you. So, first things first, GDPR is really not about compliance, and I think this is the most difficult thing for most developers, and I know most of you probably aren't developers here today, or some of you might not be, that's okay, it will give you some information to go and talk to your developer team. But the difficult thing for us to understand is that GDPR is not about compliance. We like statements, things like PCI, right? PCI has got a list of stuff. You do all these things, you're compliant. Great. ISO 27001 is similar in that it gives you a list of things that you can do. GDPR is not like that. So this is a note to self. If you go out there and you see a vendor or a new system that says, we're fully GDPR compliant, there's no such thing. There really isn't. GDPR is not a compliance law. It's all about risk-based risk-based security and risk-based privacy. It says you need to do the best to your ability in a particular situation, which means all situations will be different, which means nothing will be exactly the same. No one thing will be exactly the same as the next thing. So this is, as I said, it really is the most difficult thing for us to get our minds around, that GDPR is just not about compliance. You can't be compliant to GDPR. It's not only about consent. That's the other thing we often hear. It's really not about marketing. There's a whole different law called, it's nice to say it, the PECA, which is about marketing. I'll touch on that a little bit later. Cookies, again, this is not GDPR. It's related, but it's really not GDPR. And GDPR actually is also not about information security. Well, not only about information security. It's a very small part of the whole GDPR thing. This is what GDPR is about. This is actually word for word from Recital 4 in the GDPR. It says that the processing of personal data is designed or should be designed to serve mankind. Now, if that is not a very great objective, I don't know what is. So if we get this right, people, I'm telling you, the power is yours. First, I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about different terms and to clarify a few things. And I think it is important, as with all conversations, remember I told you my job is a little bit about being a translator? Half of that is just to make sure that when I say a thing and when you say a thing, we're actually talking about the same thing, even if we use the same words. So it really is important to understand that there might be differences in interpretation. The first thing I want to talk about is privacy is not security. Now, many of us are security experts, and that's great, but being a security expert does not make you a privacy expert. Those are two completely different disciplines. They come from they look at the world very, very differently. There is some overlap, but my personal opinion is you are one or the other, an expert in one or the other. You're not normally an expert in both. Security is about protecting the business. It's about being the castle wall. It's about being the moat. It's about being the Praetorian Guard standing in the front, watching what's going in and what's going out. If I had to sum it up in one word, I would say it's about confidentiality. Whereas privacy has got nothing to do with the business. It's got nothing to do with the business model. It's got nothing to do with how the business makes money. It really is about an individual person. The question you should be asking yourself when it comes to privacy is not, can we do something, but should we? And this is the second thing I think is really, really important to understand. When it comes to privacy, when you're thinking about GDPR, you're not thinking about how do I protect the business. You shouldn't be thinking about how can I reduce my fines. That's really not what GDPR is about. GDPR is about protecting an individual. And I think this is what makes the job of a data protection officer very difficult, because even though they're getting paid by a company, their job really is not to work for that company, but to work for individual people, which could be customers, employees, any kind of, the personal data that that company is processing. The DPO is the champion of those people, not for the business. It's a very busy slide. Don't worry about it. I've put down these two terms. So some people use them interchangeably, personal data, PII. Very technically speaking, they're not the same thing. PII is used more in America. It's defined by NIST and in HIPAA law and so on, whereas personal data is the word that they actually use and define in GDPR and European law. Graphically, I would say all PII is personal data, but not all personal data is PII. Again, doesn't really matter. Don't take this away. The thing you need to remember, as I said before, make sure you're actually talking about the same thing. If someone says PII and you think PII, just raise a question and just say, can I just stop you and ask, are we talking about the same thing? If in your company you use those words as the same thing, fair enough. But if you work in a global organization and maybe you've got American colleagues, be very careful, because what they say and what you think they're saying might not be the same. The next term I want to quickly talk about is, deep breath, because to pronounce this is pseudonymization. Yes, got that. It's the last time I'm going to say that word. That thing up there. This is actually defined in the GDPR about what that is and how that should work. And I think it's a pretty easy concept to understand for most developers. It's using a user ID, an alias of some sort, which isn't actually identifying a personal record. So you might have one table that has, name, address, all of the personal stuff around one person in there. But then for all your other stuff, it might be a separate table. So you have the user ID. So you could tie those together if you had both sets of data. So it is a reversible process. It's not complete anonymization where you never know what the original was. You can reverse that process. But important to remember here, and GDPR actually says this, is that data or the table that you have, which you use to reverse the process, to re-identify individuals, it must be kept separately. So if you are using this, and it's a really good idea, by the way, keep all your personal data one side, keep it separate. and don't allow people access. Data subject, if you're wondering what that is just the person, the individual whose data we're looking at. In most cases, it's probably going to be your end user. Not in all cases. If you're talking about applications with logins, it's probably going to be your customers. If we're talking about HR systems, for example, your end user is going to be the HR person, but the data inside is actually going to be all your employees. So not in all cases, but in most cases, it helps you to think about your end user. And then the subject access request. So just quickly going to explain what this is if you don't know. And this is one of the reasons it's important to come to this talk and listen to this information and take that away back to your company. Because what happens is any data subject, any person whose data you process can actually call you up and say, hey company, I want to know what you know about me. Write it down. Tell me where this information is. What data do you hold about me? And you know what's going to happen is your privacy team is going to probably answer that call. They're not going to be looking for that data. They're going to come back to you and say, what data do we hold about a person? So it's good to have that in mind when you start designing something from scratch. Isn't that lovely? I know we all like to retrofit legacy systems later on. But if you're designing something from the beginning, keep this in mind. How searchable is it? Can I pull out individual records? Is it easy to do? Right. These related laws, as I said, I'm going to mention them briefly. So the one is the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations, the PECA. This sits alongside data protection regulation, and that is exactly it. It's the electronic communication. So this is all about those marketing emails that you need consent for. I'm not going to go into detail on that. I'm just telling you there is a different thing. Don't blame GDPR for everything. Unfortunately, I think what happened last year, and I saw some write-ups about this, so it's not just my opinion, some other people concur with that, is that in the UK we've had data protection law for about 20 years, and this electronic communications regulations have been in place for pretty much the same, around 15 years. We've just been doing it really badly. We've just not been doing data protection very well. If you ever did data protection very well, GDPR is a no-brainer. It really doesn't change many things. But we haven't been doing that. So what people did last year is to comply with PECA and comply with data protection law, which they hadn't done before. They used this big, GDPR, I need to ask you for reconsent about stuff, which is unfortunate. It served the purpose of businesses, but it's kind of misinformation that's out there now. Data Protection Act 2018, so this is a new UK law that was brought out last year, and this sits along GDPR. It further defines things within UK law which isn't defined by European law, things like national security and immigration. So, just know it is there. It sits alongside in very particular circumstances. Again, if you don't know, go and talk to your privacy team. They're the experts on this stuff. The big thing around GDPR is this concept of privacy by design and by default. It's actually defined in Article 25, if you want to go and look it up, in the GDPR, and it says, any system that processes personal data, you must design it from the start with privacy in mind. Now again, remember that's that mind shift, because privacy is not about the business. Privacy is about the people whose data we're collecting, we're processing. And it's quite a mind shift to remember. Now, the next thing I'm going to quickly stop on is lawful basis of processing. There are 6 different bases for lawful processing. So processing is just why we need your data. Unfortunately, consent is at the top. I really wish they just stuck it at the bottom so it wasn't as obvious to people, because really consent should be your very, very last resort. There are 5 other things that you could possibly use. Most cases, and most businesses, I would say, sits between contract and legal obligation. So, for example, Amazon, right? I buy something on Amazon, they say, great, we're going to deliver it. Where do you want us to deliver it? I have to give them an address to deliver to. If I don't do it, they can't fulfill their end of the contract. That's as easy as that. They don't need to ask my permission to collect that data, because if I don't do it, they can't fulfill their contract. That's it. Legal obligation. So this is, for example, if you're an employee, your employer, the company you work for, has a legal obligation to share your name, your tax, your NI number, national insurance number, and your salary details. They have to share that with HMRC. They're not going to come around and say, oh, by the way, do you give us consent to share this information with HMRC? They don't have to do that because it's not based on consent. It's based on a legal obligation. So the next time you sign an employment contract and they say, oh, and by the way, you give us consent to process your information, well, maybe don't tell them before you sign the contract, but afterwards, go have a word. This is the easy one to remember. Consent really is not the be-all and end-all of lawful processing. It's a GDPR joke. GDPR people laugh about this. Do giggle. Rights of data subjects. So these are all the rights that data subjects have. I'm not going to go into detail on all of these, but I'm going to highlight a few which I think is important to know when you're developing an application or a new system. The first one is a right of access. So in this this is the subject access request thing we were talking about earlier. At the point of collection, you have to be able to tell data subjects and users, people whose data you have, what you're collecting, why you're collecting it, what you're going to do with it, and how long you'll be keeping it, as well as who you'll be sharing it with. So this has to be before you start collecting it. So these are the privacy notices that you see pop up whenever you're trying to fill in a form and you go, privacy, yes, whatever. But you have to show people that information. Obviously, as a developer, you shouldn't be defining any of this information, but you should be asking these questions. This would be a good time to say, great, once we, want to collect this data, we're on this screen. I need to give people a privacy notice. Come on, privacy people, DPO, where is it? I need to be able to answer all of these questions. Right to rectification. So if stuff is incorrect, a data subject, a user, have the right to actually make you update it and make you change it. What does this mean for me as a developer? Well, it means that everything can be changed. Names can be changed. Surnames can be changed. Date of births can possibly be changed, especially if you've made a mistake. Email addresses can be changed. So make sure that those fields are updatable in whatever system you're designing. Don't use an email address, for example, as your key identifier in a table, because what happens if I have to update that? Even if my email address is the username to log into a system, if I then tell you, actually, I've changed my email address, do I have to open a whole new account? That seems a bit silly to me as a user. I just want to say, I'm using a new email address. Can I just use that as my username now? Is that easy enough to do? Right to erasure. When I speak to developers, this one actually grows tentacles, grows arms and legs. People have loads of questions around this. The first thing you have to know is that the right to erasure is not an absolute right. You don't always have to delete all of the data. For me, I found it very difficult to explain, so I went to my favorite privacy Twitter account. The Privacy Puffin explains this very well. If there's a law or a contract still in place or a life and death scenario that requires your personal data to be processed, then erasure is not available. And some of those laws could be just the company law. So the Companies Act, in very broad terms, again, I'm not a legal expert here, in very broad terms, the Companies Act normally says you have to keep transactional data for 6 years, 7 years, 6+1 or something to that effect. So to prove that your company's done business with you, or a company has done business with a client, they have to keep those records. So a client can't come and call you and say, you need to delete my data, because that transaction says you bought this table on this date for this amount, this person. That's business historical transactional data. For accounting purposes, they need that information. It can't just be deleted. So what does this mean for me as a developer? It's ask that question. Know that not everything must be able to be erased, but some things might. So how does that affect how I architecture this system? Talk to your legal, your privacy people. Which data might have to be deleted in the future? Because if you delete fields from a record, does that break the system? What happens to your logs when you do that? Is that really awkward? Could you put the data that might have to be deleted in the future, could you put that in a separate table? So you can delete stuff from there and it doesn't matter, but your main stuff is not affected? Those are the things you need to ask questions about. The right to restrict processing and the right to object. So again, this is your users, your data subjects. They have this right. Can they do that in your system? If I call up a company and say, hey, I don't know where you got my data from. I think it's illegal. You need to stop processing my data. Can you do that in your application? Can you flag a record that says, this must be stopped processing, i.e. it doesn't come into reports, it's not used for aggregate data, all of it, you have to literally stop processing it. Can you do that? Also, when that restriction is lifted, so it's been investigated and the company says, no, we have a right to process this data, you have to then tell the data subject again that you're starting to process it. How does that work? Does it come into exception reports? Right? Think about that. Next one, data portability. Sorry about the wording. This is actually from the legal act. But the best way to describe this, and this is probably the easiest one that you didn't know you were doing. See, you were really doing something that complies with GDPR. Yay. When you open a new bank account nowadays, you just say, oh, got a new bank account. Can you speak to my old bank and just get all my debit orders and things moved across? And they do that automatically by magic. I promise you, they're not sitting there handwriting down numbers and codes and things. It's probably a download into CSV, XML, something like that, and it's an upload on the other side. And that's what this basically is. It says that when you move to a different provider, you need to be able to easily get your data in a machine-readable format. And as I said, I'm pretty sure this is probably the easiest thing you can do to be GDPR compliant. Make it electronic. Yay! Next, we get to GDPR principles. These are all the GDPR principles, and as before, I'm not going to talk about every single one, just the ones that I think are really relevant to this audience. So there's those 6 principles, and then the accountability one, which kind of stands apart. And the accountability principle says that you must be able to demonstrate that you're doing the 6 that come before. And how do we demonstrate stuff? We have documentation. So what does that mean for me as a developer? Keep documentation, please. Tell us what you're doing and why you're doing it, more importantly. Lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. We talked about this a little bit before, but every time you get a piece of data, a piece of personal data, you need to know what you're collecting, why you're collecting it, where is it going, and where is it stored. Right? So is it stored just in this little database over here? What happens when you back that up? Does that go to one place? Do you have multiple backups? Do you have multiple backups in different places? Because that's still the data. It's not just about the main database. It's about all of these things. Where is it? Where is it going? Who do you send it to? You need to know this. Well, you need to ask those questions of the people, your privacy experts. But from a technical architecture point of view, you should be able to answer this question, especially the bottom 2. Where is it going and where is it stored? Purpose limitation. This is an interesting one, an interesting challenge, I think, for developers out there. Personal data can only be used for the purpose for which it was collected. And actually, I want you to think back to the last time you read a privacy notice. It probably said something along the lines of, we are collecting the personal data we need to collect in order to fulfill the business objectives that we will define at some point whenever we feel like it, and we will be keeping that for as long as we need to. So the GDPR says you need to say all of those things, but it actually asks you to be specific. Collecting data for business purposes doesn't tell me why you're needing it. So you need to be specific. And then once you are specific about it, you can only use it for that purpose. You're not allowed to use it then for a different purpose. So if someone comes to you as a developer and they say, oh, you've got this data in this table, I just want to connect this other system into it because we want these reports to go here and there, they're going to sell it on to this person and so on. The challenge for you is, hold on a moment, am I allowed to do that? And have you talked to the privacy team? The next principle in GDPR is actually called data minimization. And I've put it in different words because, remember I told you sometimes I say a thing and you hear another thing? Words mean different things to different people. But what they mean by data minimization is that you need to collect the minimum data that's necessary for that purpose, which we've just defined. So if you're using a library or a template, go through it. Don't just say, oh, well, I got this from a mate of mine or someone's already done some of the work. This is a similar application. I'm just going to use all of these fields. You have to ask the question, do we need all of that data? My golden rule is, if you don't have it, you can't lose it. And that's what makes it really important. It helps security if you just don't collect too much data. Just use what you need, collect what you need. Accuracy. So this comes back, we've already talked about stuff must be able to be updated, to be rectified. Things should also be accurate. So I've got a little example that happened to me. So I've got a bit of a funny surname. Well, it's not funny to me, it's just funny in this context in the UK. It's 2 words with a space in the middle, with one is a small letter and one is a capital letter. And this is not the only system that I try to register that says you're not using a proper surname. Like, excuse me, mate, that is my surname. That's the way it is. That's the correct way to spell it. Where input validation just says, sorry, your surname is wrong. Like, no, it's not wrong. Your bias in developing is wrong, but that's a talk for a different topic for a different talk. You know, my daughter's surname is 3 words with 2 spaces and different capitals and non-capitals, right? So don't do this. Just make things usable and make sure that you can accurately reflect data. Storage limitation. Again, I've not used that word on the slide because it means different things when you're talking to technical people. The GDPR, and I've talked about this when I mentioned privacy notice, says only keep data for as long as necessary. Now, as long as necessary is not a time frame. This is why GDPR is lovely, because remember, it's that risk-based thing. You define what is necessary. But that's the thing, you need to actually define it. Someone has to tell you how long that is. Necessary is not a time frame. It's got to be 2 months, 3 months, 5 years, 6 years, 10 years. Someone has to tell you what that is, and you've got to make them tell you. Please do. So when you're designing your system, do you put in some, automated deletion script of something to that effect that says this data we only need for 6 months, thereafter they'll be deleted? What does that do to your system? What does that do to your logs? Can we delete that without breaking your application? Can we change that time frame? If we review this in a year's time and say, actually, we now need it for only 3 months or maybe a bit longer, can you change that? Think about that when you're developing your system. Integrity and confidentiality. So this is the only little bit that talks about security in GDPR. Basically, it says, don't lose stuff. So the actual word says you need to use appropriate technical and organizational methods to protect the data that you're keeping. It does not define what appropriate technical and organizational methods is. Unfortunately, it does say, use examples. GDPR says, for example, encryption. For example, pseudonymization. Oh, I did it again. For example, they use these things. It doesn't mean everything has to be encrypted. You need to look at your system. What data are you keeping? How much of it are you keeping? Where are you keeping it? Is it in the cloud? Is it in a public-facing system? Because, then I would suggest you probably need to encrypt that. Is it in an internal system? Is it, behind various other things? I don't know. I don't understand your system. You need to, as I said, do a risk assessment. What is your threat model? How can people get into the data? How do I keep it secure? Please do document what you're doing, because that, again, would be useful to show GDPR compliance, but more like if there's a breach, so you can go back and say, well, we made this decision, we designed it this way because of such and such a reason. What else can I do? So this, as a developer, the main thing is be that annoying 3-year-old. Why? Why are we doing this? Can we do that? Why are we doing that? Why do we need all of this data? Why are we collecting it? Why are we keeping it? Why are we keeping it for 10 years? Ask those questions and make people actually answer them. And if they don't, just document it anyway. When there's personal data involved, please involve your privacy team. And I'm going to emphasize this again. Security people aren't privacy experts. Privacy experts aren't security experts. So, when we're in a situation where we say, oh, project's just gone live, but I really wish they talked to the security team in the beginning and I could have helped them, the privacy people feel exactly the same way. So when you're developing a new system and there's any sort of personal data involved, make sure you involve the DPO or someone with some privacy experience right from the start. Remember that GDPR says privacy by design and by default. But make sure you get those things in from the start. It's much easier to do that than to try and fix things later on. Keep your wikis and documentations up to date. We all love doing it, but it's really, really very helpful to define all of those things, purposes, how long we're keeping data for, at the time that it was discussed. Because that also happens 2 years down the line. You're like, oh, why are we keeping this data for 10 years? No one knows, because someone came up with a random number at some point. Document those decisions as you keep going through the design process. And as I just said on the previous point, a general description of the security measures and the risk assessment that helped you get there is really, really useful. So, in summary, privacy is not security. When personal data is involved, call the privacy team. Make sure those questions are answered. What are we collecting? Why are we collecting it? How long do we need it for? Make sure you can update stuff. Think about those situations where you need to update things or delete things and what that does to your system. Hopefully it doesn't break it. Documentation is important. But most importantly, if you're not sure, ask. I really hope that this talk has given you some information, some ammunition to go and ask the questions that need to be answered. And make sure that you then speak to the right people and involve them in your projects. That's it from me. I'm happy to take questions. If I can't answer them, I'll promise to go away and find the answers. Oh, yes, there's one.
Part of the basis for this talk was geographic development. And one of the ways that things are changing at the moment is machine learning and artificial intelligence. So we've gone from a world where the developer did the algorithm and carefully created some dummy data so we test that it worked. Which was never real data, it was memorized. And that was my data. But now in a world where you don't know the algorithm, you're machine learning, you're trying to get that device itself, and you probably want to use online data to do it through. Are you seeing the ways that people think themselves and start thinking about that in terms of is that data useful, how should you use it? And when you come to a question like right now, you develop an algorithm based on the information that's applied to you. Is that having an effect? And are you seeing that start to play out in answers?
I'm seeing the questions being asked, definitely. The answers, I'm not so sure about that. Because, it's those questions. So it comes back about understanding what you're doing. And yes, you might not know the algorithm in detail, but it's right at the start about what data you're collecting and what's the purpose you're collecting it for. If we're actually putting there, well, the purpose is to improve our systems or to teach our machine learning thingy, at least you've been clear about that from the very beginning. Then you also need to consider that right to erasure is, as I said, luckily not all data can be erased, but it's definitely something to think about. If someone there says, actually, I want you to stop processing my data, I want you to stop doing that, can you just stop? Can you take that away? Can you remove it from the system? Probably not. So, as I said, the answers aren't really there, but definitely the questions are being answered. And with all of these things, you need all of those experience in the same room, right? You need the privacy people who can actually interpret the law. You need the developers who can actually, hopefully, explain to you what they're doing, how that works. And we all need to talk around to make sure that we're doing the right thing. And yes, testing systems is a very interesting dynamic. Because never have I read a privacy statement that says, we're going to use your data in our testing systems as well. But in some places, it's absolutely needed. Documentation is my best advice for all of that. Just document when you've had a discussion and what the results were. Because as I said, GDPR doesn't say you can't do it. It just says you need to make a risk-based decision. So once you've documented that, that should help. Anything else? Great. Well, I hope you found that useful. Welcome to talk to me afterwards, and you've got some time for maybe a quick cup of coffee before we finish today. Thank you.